Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Well, good afternoon, Peter, and welcome in.
Well, good afternoon, Bernard. I've missed you
to
this
everyone.
week. I feel as though I haven't talked to you nearly enough since. In fact, I don't think I've talked to you this week since last week's Hoon. Is that right?
Yeah, not in person. There's
yeah.
been a bit of back and forth on the internets,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's great to have you, and great to have a
And
sunny
what a gorgeous
day.
day. It's. I mean, isn't it amazing how I'm pretty sure I've been afflicted by seasonal affective disorder this year, and yet I look out and it's just absolutely exquisite. There's a harbour. There's tuis making love in the trees here. It's you've got to appreciate small things.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a beautiful picture of a tui.
Is it making
absolutely
love? My
ravaging.
daughter's going to vomit if she listens to this. And hears me use those. Just have that
Absolutely
expression.
ravaging a tree
Yeah.
nearby, and makes me feel happy. So it's been a heck of a week too for us. I put out a thing on Sunday about the Kaka project 2026.
Oh, I didn't see that. Gosh, I'm terribly sorry. Was this your new manifesto?
It was essentially a message to everyone that I really want to focus on some positive policies and just trying to get out of the Steve Bannon created wall of noise that we see from governments and those who want to do things to us. And sometimes it's useful to step out of the news flow and try to understand what's going on. So that's
I've been told off for saying Jesus too many times in our show as well, by the way. Yep.
So
what have you? Is this the new positive, Bernard, without the negative Peter? Is this 2026 without Peter?
No, absolutely not. No, it's the Hoon is central, but what we're doing is coming up with a few ways to ask questions about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. When I say we, I'm talking about Aotearoa, and also coming up with some solutions. So, for example, this week we've had more drama around the electricity market. And this morning I included a suggestion from a bunch of electricity economists that the way to go is to reform the market and to have a very quick and rapid subsidised rollout of solar on roofs. Yeah. So that's the sort of
exactly.
thing we can talk
I think
about.
that's so good because it's and we did talk about you doing what's known as solutions journalism, or at least having that bent, not pulling any punches, but also offering what the alternative might be, because you don't want to just go down the Hosking route, as it were. That's ROUTE. But you don't want to go down that kind of route of negativity or pulling back and just saying, "Oh, Jesus Christ, everything's fine, right? Why are we doing this? It's all just too woke." Because it's not. I think that's thing that you said about electricity is very positive. I'm interested in there's some strings being pulled here, Bernard. Somebody we both know who's in the PR industry is rather pleased, it seems, with the way this debate about high energy prices and shortages of energy have gone. And I don't know quite whether they're pushing the agenda of fossil fuels companies and exploration or the gentailers themselves.
Yeah, this is a story which has been brewing for a decade, really. The electricity generators, who 3 of the 4 are 51% owned by the government, essentially have sat on the generation stock and milked it for dividends for a decade. Because even though we knew this electrification was going to come and would need to come, we didn't have an increase in demand at that time. And there was some uncertainty about where the TY point would stay. So those big gentailers basically said, right, well, we're not quite sure. What we are sure of is that we are all about the shareholder and we're going to pump as much cash as we can to shareholders. And in the end, they pumped $4 in dividends for every $1 they reinvested in new generation. At the same time, they were actually, taking out of action a bunch of gas and coal generation simply because it was old and didn't replace it. Or if they did, they didn't add extra on top of it. They had plenty of projects that were consented. That wasn't the issue. And also, when you look at this gas debate, the government saying, "Oh, it was all Labor and Greens' fault because they wouldn't allow us to
Dig, baby,
explore."
dig. Drill,
Yeah,
baby, drill.
yeah. Well, that's actually not true. Yes, the new licenses to drill offshore were not given, but there were still old licenses that were still being used, both onshore and offshore, and they just didn't find any fresh gas, and that's the
But I
problem.
did hear a chat from Taranaki, from the gas industry in Taranaki the other day, saying that this is sort of just the signals are just too confused, that they're trying to extract more from existing fields, and they still. I mean, discussed this with Catherine before, and I remain a sort of we need gas to bridge kind of person, and you and Catherine are much more on the we just can't do it, we just can't put out anymore.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that we, leave what's there in the ground. You probably should use it as a bridge, but you shouldn't be adding to it, and you shouldn't be stepping back onto it when you have a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
The government right now is saying our only solution is to import LNG, which is simply not true.
Yeah, no, well,
It's
and we don't have anywhere to import it to. Do you think politically, Bernard, I know we normally get to New Zealand politics at the end, and I was going to do media this afternoon, but do you think that there's tension between Simeon Brown and who I think is the energy minister, is that right? And
Shane
Shane,
Jones.
who is Shane Jones, who is the I think resources minister. What's going on?
So it's hard to tell. I mean, Shane is a remarkable performer, and certainly knows how to push the right buttons at the right time. Simeon knows how to push buttons, although he's much more focused on his own government's message. There's some interesting tensions there. I suspect Simeon would go down the Shane Jones route to intervene in the market if he could. I'm not sure he's some sort of very dry and hands-off markets guy. He'd quite like to get in there as well. The trouble is both of them are all about the gas and the coal and the oil.
Yeah.
And Simeon, on top of that, is very keen on driving fast, not thinking about the safety or the climate impacts of
yeah, but that's just like
his
let's just not do the full round of Simeon. Although I did notice he always seems to be the Jiminy Cricket just popping up behind Christopher Luxon's shoulder. Bernard, shall we do a little bit of media news before we go to climate and Catherine, and also
Yes, go for it.
I was thrilled to see Paddy Gower joining Stuff, which is the media story of the week in a sense. They still seem to have no idea what he's actually going to do, which is just RNZ. So he's got a bit of a blank canvas. In fact, they might call it blank
Paddy
canvas.
knows what he's going to do.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought he was wonderful on RNZ, relieving for Catherine Ryan. It's the first time I've listened to that show for quite a long time. And he did a good job the other day on Lester Levy, the new health authority chairman, or is commissioner. And I think we should explore that a bit more. I'm talking to somebody tomorrow who may give us some insight into Lester Levy. The other thing I thought was really good today, Bernard, was Guy Espiner from RNZ keeps doing pretty good investigative work on the various conflicts of interest or alleged conflicts of interest with government ministers. And he did his latest one, of course, on Casey Costello and the tobacco industry, and showed that Philip Morris has been very effective in shifting this debate. And then you've got McKee on gun control. It's a very dodgy. I mean, Jack Tame did a great job with her, it seemed, on Sunday. This is pretty dodgy stuff.
Yeah, I think it's clear now that the cabinet is broken into the A team and the B team, and the B team are made up of the ACT and New Zealand First ministers, particularly the ones underneath the top tier, who are ministers for the first time, relatively new politicians, quite vulnerable to being exposed for their previous lives, and they have been given a fairly loose set of reins, and at some point Christopher Luxon and hopefully both David Seymour and Winston Peters start to tighten the reins on those what I'd call minor ministers. And we're talking here about Karen Chua, as you say, Casey Costello, and they are really sailing close to the wind in terms of cabinet manuals, conflicts of interest, and the danger here for Christopher Luxon is that the opponents who want to paint him as a millionaire out of touch with New Zealand who's selling off the business selling himself as a businessman able to run government like a business. There's a danger here that his opponents just insert in there at the end
Yeah.
of that line, and he's running it for business.
Absolutely, and we know, we've had this with Jacinda. I mean, what could actually be quite good is if somebody like Chris Hipkins or Helen Clark, or together, suggested a sort of cross-party approach to this, to just sort out this thing about lobbying, get it all a bit more transparent. I'm just interested that it is the publicly owned broadcasters, RNZ and TVNZ, who are doing a particularly good job on this, and I just don't see it really being drawn out elsewhere other than on the Hoon. Now, I have a slight climate story, which will allow us to do a segue to Catherine,
Right.
because I'm not obsessed, but I'm extremely intrigued by the loss of the superyacht Bayesian, owned by Mike Lynch. Now, I used to know Mike a little bit when I did some things with Autonomy, which was a company that I was absolutely fascinated with and did some business with when I was at the Times. And in fact, our producer Simon was asking me just before whether I felt the story had been overdone. And I don't think you can get enough about a multi-millionaire, potentially a billionaire, and a 56-meter super yacht sinking in about 5 minutes.
At
And
the
it's
same
really
time
interesting.
as one of the people who testified in his case got run down. by
That's
a
right.
car.
That's right. There is a bit of a conspiracy, but let's also remember that his chief. I mean, there's a wonderful. I could put it on the show notes, but Mike Lynch, of course, has just escaped. He was extradited to the US to face these fraud charges over the $9 billion acquisition of Autonomy by HP. HP at that point was running around like a headless chicken buying things, and then when the bill came, they sort of took a look at the Autonomy accounts. The Autonomy chief financial officer is, I think, was convicted and in fact is still in jail. But it is a really interesting New Zealand story as well. Bayesian was designed by Ron Holland, who was a famous New Zealand super yacht designer and yacht designer, now based in Vancouver. It didn't in fact have a mast, or doesn't in fact have a mast built by Southern Spars, unlike most super yachts. But it had a New Zealand skipper. It's going to be a very interesting story about how on earth that could happen. And I was looking today as I was cycling along the waterfront. Perseus is a rather amazing super yacht, probably the biggest super yacht in New Zealand at the moment, down on the waterfront. And I thought, I wonder what they're thinking about water spouts and things like that. And of course, this appears to be partly because the temperature of the Mediterranean has been up to 30 degrees, 3 degrees above normal. Catherine.
Genius segue.
Segue.
Because today we're all
Absolutely.
about ocean temperatures.
Yes, so I've seen actually a bunch of things that have come out about ocean heating in the last couple of weeks, and it's so it's a really interesting phenomenon that is starting to get a lot more research going into it. And of course, there's a lot more energy in the oceans as they get warmer. So you see a lot of different things starting to happen because of that. So yeah, it is. There will be a connection there. I don't know, exactly how much you can attribute what happened with that water spout to climate change, but there will be some kind of, everything that happens weather-wise these days happens within a context of,
That's right.
warmer temperatures and more energy in the system and more precipitation, and so there's always a connection.
And the research is suggesting that the exchange of carbon between the sea and the ocean might be getting out of whack, and that could be important.
Yeah, well, there's some different things going on, and there's some different pieces of research, but one in particular that was quite interesting, also because it's kind of in our backyard. They were looking at the Southern Ocean, and the understanding in terms of how they do climate modelling at the moment, and the current understanding of what happens is that colder waters, the colder the water is, the more carbon dioxide it can absorb. We know that the oceans in general have absorbed something like 25% of the carbon dioxide that humans are responsible for. And the Southern Ocean, they were attributing about 40% of the total amount that oceans were absorbing of that CO2 was being absorbed by the Southern Ocean.
Is that because it gets funneled down there somehow, Catherine?
No, I think because of the temperature of the ocean, it's colder, and therefore, colder water absorbs more carbon dioxide. But this piece of research is starting to bring that into question, because there's some different processes going on in there that may not be fully accounted for, different forces doing different things, and they weren't quite sure which of those forces was stronger or weaker. And so what they were looking at is we know that the Southern Ocean has there's a lot of weather down there. They have a lot of storms, and in fact they say that for any particular part of the Southern Ocean, it would on average see one storm a week with several days of strong wind. So no matter where you are, they're getting storms. And those storms cause a lot of turbulence that mix the water. So they mix surface water, which is warmer, with the colder, deeper water. And so the question mark that they had was, is that as that colder water comes up nearer the surface, is it absorbing more carbon dioxide from the air? Or is it because that colder, deeper water is already has more carbon already mixed in it? It's because of the remineralization of organic matter that sunk to the bottom of the ocean. So it's already denser with that stuff. So does that mean that it releases carbon dioxide when it comes up to the surface? And so we've done a whole lot of...
That feels a bit like some sort of tipping point, a feedback loop, which makes things worse.
Yeah, I don't think it counts as far as I know, that doesn't count as a tipping point, although deoxygenation of the water overall could well do, but that's probably a long way off at the moment. But what they did with this study is they used Argo floats as well as modelling to look at what was happening when those storms were affecting the Southern Oceans, and what they found is that there is more outgassing of carbon dioxide from those oceans than what they thought was happening, and particularly at the higher latitudes, like closer to Antarctica, there's more coming out than what they thought. So it's releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than they previously thought it was. And so that means instead of, the Southern Ocean always been regarded as a big carbon sink, it may not be doing that job as well as we thought, and probably it's getting worse at doing that job because of the increasing number and intensity of storms that are happening.
And some research was some analysis on the electrification of the global economy and the enormous growth of solar panel and battery production out of China, but also increasingly the installation of it, but at high latitudes. Could you talk about a report from EMBA and what implications it has?
Yeah, it's a really interesting report. EMBA is a think tank that specialises in electrification and the electricity market globally. So they released a 2024 global electricity review or report of what's been going on with that. And in it, they talk about this massive offtake in solar, particularly. I mean, it was at record levels in 2023, and then it doubled down on that again in 2024. So there's been a huge amount of increase in the amount of solar panels that have been made and the amount that have been installed. But the countries that they are predominantly being installed in are not necessarily the sunniest countries in the world. It's quite often in less sunny countries. And what that means is that those installations are not as efficient as they would be if they were being installed in some really sunny countries. So what that means is we would be getting a lot more bang for our collective buck if a lot more of those solar panels were being installed either in some of the Middle East.
Presumably, Catherine, though, one of the motivations for doing it is the local cost of energy. And that it may be, with low cost solar. I mean, I've told you before, I did this in the UK. We had solar panels on our roof in London that fed straight back into the grid, and it was at a very, very good rate. But it was really a personal decision to do it.
Yeah, a lot of those good rates are because of policy, like that it's been mandated by the government in terms of what rates you receive. So in New Zealand, we don't have a lot of strong policy in that area, so you don't see a lot of high uptake of panels. So yeah, that's a part of what drives it. But what you also find when you look at the costs of solar panels versus the costs of other kinds of electricity is that they're often being looked at with, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the equation that they use, the levelized cost of energy, AUKO. And AUKO is not very good at looking at different types of energy. So you shouldn't really be using it to compare the costs of things when you're looking at fossil fuels versus renewable energy, because it doesn't include any grid costs. And what we know about renewable energy is that beyond a certain level of percentage of installation, your grid costs suddenly change. And one of the constraints actually about the implementation of more solar in countries like in places like California or China is that you have to have a certain number of, you need to be able to plug them into the grid, and maybe the grid isn't ready, so they need to actually do a lot more grid work in order to get it there. But the main point I was going to make about developing countries in particular is that we should be spending a lot more in climate funding to get some of those solar panels installed in places where it's sunnier and where they're going to get a lot more value from them, and where you also get the benefit of sustainable development and resilience to climate change as well. It's higher. And so there's a lot of good reasons to do that.
And that's a great point, Catherine, on going sunny and going to developing economies. And actually, there's one great news story right now, which is Pakistan, which has literally blanketed the country.
You don't often hear about Pakistan doing great things,
blanketed the country with solar, enormous amounts of Chinese panels coming in, 13% of their existing supply. They added that in solar panels in a year. In part because of an explosion of costs, because of a problem with the way they'd set up their industry beforehand. But that's a really good example. And actually, it's China that's leading the way there, very strong relationship with Pakistan. And it would be great to see the rest of the world, roll these panels out across the developed world in a proper way. And interestingly, it's only China that's really making that happen at the moment. Catherine, thank you very much.
Catherine, thanks so much. But by all means, stay, of course. Now, may I welcome Dr. Jamie Shea from Chatham House, from the real Chatham House, not just from the Chatham House rule, but actually from the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, known as Chatham House. Although I think you're in Brussels, actually, Jamie.
Absolutely correct. In Brussels, and as you can see, the sun is trying to come up this morning.
Yeah. Now, Jamie, you haven't aged a day since you were the NATO spokesman, and on television virtually every night during the First and Second Gulf Wars, was it? Oh no, Yugoslavia. It must have been.
You may believe the non-aging thing, Peter, but I think you're the only one in the world who would do that. But thank you all the same. At my age, encouragement is always very welcome.
And we've also got Professor Robert Patman, who is the head of international affairs at Otago University. Robert, let me introduce you, if you don't know him already, to Jamie Shea, who is somebody I've known a little while. In fact, I talked to Jamie maybe 18 months ago about Jacinda Ardern going to NATO and what that meant and what AUKUS meant. So we thought we would have. I mean, it's fantastic. It's a privilege to have you on, Jamie, and very kind of you to do it so early in the morning. We thought we'd start with Ukraine and this push by the Ukrainians, this rather clever, or we hope, sort of intriguing push into the rump of, into the rump of Vladimir Putin, which is entirely what it is, actually. And what the chances of success are, what success might be. You've written about some of this already, Jamie. I mean, I wonder, maybe you could take the lead on this and just tell us what you think is going on with this, what the politics of it are, and what the military aspect of it is.
Well, first of all, Peter, good to see you again. Bernard and Robert, good to see you all, and thanks very much for having me on the podcast this morning. It's an honour. Well, yes, I mean, clearly the Ukrainians were in an increasingly dire situation prior to August the 6th, when they carried out this incursion into Russia, into the Kursk Oblast. They were on the defensive. Their previous offensive last year had failed, up against very strong Russian defensive fortifications. The Russians were advancing, albeit very slowly, but still advancing, and risking to capture the entire sort of Donbass-Donetsk region, which clearly is one of Putin's key war aims. He He's claimed to have annexed a lot of it, as you know, and incorporated it into Russia already. So there was a real perception that the Russians were starting to win and the Ukrainians were starting to lose, or serious risk of losing. So I think Zelensky had to do something really bold to try to sort of change the equation, and by going into Russia, he's obviously boosted the morale of his own forces. This is the first success that the Ukrainians have had since the autumn of 2022. Secondly, he's demonstrated that the Ukrainians can use their Western-supplied equipment more effectively in more sort of open field combined arms operations. This is a war of movement, which we haven't really seen for a long time in Ukraine. And war of movement plays to the Ukrainian advantage. That's their way of warfare, in the way that attrition and defensive operations have played to the advantage of Russia. And he's had two basic aims in doing this. Number one is simply to push the Russians back from his front lines. This is a little bit the same sort of thing that the Russians have been trying to do to him. In other words, capturing slices of territory on the border. So you push the airfields back, you push the artillery back, you make it harder for the Russians to carry out these missile strikes. But not impossible, of course, because you simply use longer range missiles. But nonetheless, it does take some of the heat off of cities like Kharkiv on the border, which have been extensively bombed by Russia recently. The second objective is the idea of seizing a chunk of Russian territory as a bargaining chip. He's now got something that Putin wants, which he hopes can force Putin to the negotiating table, and will be a quid pro quo in eventual peace talks for the Russians, obviously vacating more of Ukrainian territory. The other objective, which was an entirely reasonable one, was to convince the Russians, or force the Russians, to withdraw a chunk of their army currently attacking towards Potrovsk in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass area, to get them to redeploy to defend Holy Russia.
Which seems to be happening to some extent, doesn't it? But not, Potrovsk is still in trouble.
It's difficult, Peter, to get a good picture, if you're not sort of inside some intelligence agency in a NATO country, or even in New Zealand, because obviously both sides come up with counterclaims and videos that suggest that they've got the advantage. It's not easy to sort of pick your way through this, but the Russians are, unfortunately for Ukraine, continuing to advance. They're obviously trying not to fall into that trap. They say that they've got enough forces. They've got about 600,000 troops in Ukraine, so they've got quite a lot to be able to continue to do both, to push the Ukrainians out of the Kursk Oblast, and of course to continue attacking. So it's still early days yet. We have to wait and see how this all plays out.
And Jenny,
I think
in
for
your
Ukraine, just final comment, the key thing is they have to hold on to this territory, because if they don't hold on to this territory, they would have lost a lot of men and material for no real strategic purpose.
And from a NATO point of view, just sort of perhaps putting on your old hat in a sense, how important is this to show their Western military donors, to show Western supporters that they can take the initiative, that they can go kinetic and fast, and, as you said, a mobile, moving front?
Yes, well, NATO itself has not reacted, so we've had individual reactions from individual allies. Most have been positive in the sense, number one, this is legitimate for Ukraine to do, it's legal, it's part of their self-defense. Russia attacked them first, and this is just another way, this is not so much invading Russia, but this is just another way of improving their defensive situation. And secondly, which is what the Ukrainians really need to hear, we are okay, with Ukraine using our weapons.
Yeah, which is a shift, right?
The UK Challenger 2 tanks on the territory. But where Zelensky, I think, is very frustrated at the moment is he really wants the US, the UK, France and others, Germany, to give Kiev the green light to use longer range cruise missiles to strike deeper into Russia. He claims
Storm Shadow.
What he really needs to do to impede.
Do you mean the
Russian
Storm
war
Shadow?
effort.
The UK
so far,
Storm
the Allies
Shadow?
think that that's a red line.
Yeah, but they are using the American HIMARS system, it seems, to take out these various bridges, correct? So, I mean, it was interesting that Zelensky didn't tell the West, tell his Western backers, or allegedly didn't tell his Western backers, that he was moving in.
That's what he says, and we had Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany and Moldova yesterday saying, "Oh no, I had no idea, I wasn't informed." So everybody's been saying this, and I think there has been some sort of understanding that the Ukrainians can't sort of ask permission from NATO formally. Every time they're planning something, that would obviously take away any operational secrecy. It would give the game away. So there is a sort of some sort of understanding that provided that they keep to those sort of red lines of not using F-16s against Moscow or trying to carry out long-range sort of interdiction strikes against St. Petersburg, that they have the latitude to sort of do this. I imagine, Peter, again, as I said, I'm not privy to this, but probably intelligence agencies must have known that they were up to something, because they gathered, obviously, a lot of troops, 12,000 troops, some of their best troops, plus a lot of equipment on the border before they went in.
And presumably, they're using targeting information from other sources. Robert, may I bring you into this, so not to squeeze you out for a second week in a row after last week's situation with Halle. I mean, does this mean negotiations, or does it mean an end to negotiations? Does it mean that they are grabbing a piece of the pie in order to put themselves in a stronger position for negotiations?
Well, I think it's an attempt, as Jamie's indicated, if there are any negotiations, an attempt to improve their negotiating position. Because, as one Ukrainian commentator said recently, we've always believed that Putin wasn't serious about negotiations. This might make him more serious. And, of course, the Ukrainian ploy will be, in return, we will end our invasion if you end yours. I mean, putting it bluntly. And so this is seen as a potential way, I think, of restoring internationally recognised borders between the two countries. It's ambitious, and as Jamie just indicated, that it's a high risk effort, but the strategic rewards, and I think the political psychological dimension to this also ought to be emphasised. I think this is for a long time the Zelensky government has not shared what they see as the inflated view of Russian power. And this Kursk incursion has demonstrated to the world that the Putin regime is struggling to defend its internationally recognized borders while invading another country. In other words, the strong man is not quite as strong as he may appear. And I think the Ukrainians, in a sense, they have, by launching this operation, they've also, I think, prompted some reassessment, and Jamie can correct me here, within Western capitals about what red lines and where do they apply, because Mr. Putin always said at the beginning he's had a whole series of red lines, and each of these have been crossed with the you may recall that he said that when the HIMARS were acquired, if they were acquired, that would be a red line that could have catastrophic consequences. And then the F-16 are similar sort of threats, and they've been acquired, and there's been, the world hasn't come to an end. And now we have the breach of Russia's territorial integrity as the price of their invasion of another country. So in a sense, I think, this is a shrewd move in many respects. It's high risk, but I think it also opens up a lot of possibilities. And I think the Ukrainians are very mindful that the Russian military, some elements, senior elements within it, have not been happy. They were, Peter Rutland, the American Russian specialist, published a really excellent article in mid-February 2022 when he quoted senior Russian retired officers as publicly coming out against any prospect of the invasion of Ukraine, which they said would be catastrophic. Now, the reason I mention this is because I think there are certain elements in the Russian military are not happy with the invasion itself, and they're certainly not happy with the way it's gone. And in a sense, this is politically dangerous now for Mr. Putin.
What is it? Just
the military.
Jamie, let me bring you in here. Can you challenge Robert's assertions about this? Because of course, there's not we're not dealing with a country where the Russian media is in a sense turning against Putin, or can turn against Putin over the movement into the Kursk Oblast. We've had, I think, him correcting or being rather rude to the governor of the Kursk Oblast about the number of villages that have been taken. What's the climate there?
Yes, well, I don't think Putin's in any immediate danger of sort of being deposed like Khrushchev was, back in 1964 after the Cuban fiasco of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what the Ukraine is being successful at doing, and I have to agree with Robert, I'd like to challenge him, but I have to agree with him, is sort of bringing the reality of the war home to the average Russian. Putin's success so far has been to call this a limited military operation, taking place in a faraway country of which we know very little. You remember that phrase, where Russia isn't sort of in any way being affected. Life goes on. Cafes and restaurants in Moscow are full on the summer evenings.
But there might be a couple of Ukrainian drones coming to those cafes, though.
Yeah, but exactly. 11 drones were fired against Moscow, although they were all shot down. Moscow is very heavily defended, as you can well imagine. But I don't suppose the Ukrainians are thinking that the drones are going to land on the Kremlin. They just want to show that they can do this, and Moscow is not invulnerable. And in the Kursk Oblast, well over 100,000 Russian civilians have had to be evacuated. They're all complaining on Russian TV. That they haven't been well looked after by the local authorities, that there were no plans. The Ukrainians are also managing to blow up oil depots in Rostov, in Belgorod, in a number of places, which is both hampering the Russian war effort, taking away the energy supplies, but also, again, bringing home the reality of the war. They've even managed to blow up a railway tunnel, in a very daring special operation as far away as Siberia. Now, none of this, Russia is an enormous country with enormous resources, enormous population. None of this is going to change the equation right away. But as I've said, it does, however, demonstrate to the average Russian that there's a real war going on here, and that the Russian civil population, albeit in a far less degree than the Ukrainian population, which has suffered grievously in terms of the number of refugees, displaced people, but are being affected as well. Putin, is the master of, as you mentioned yourself, Peter, of displacing the blame onto others and coming across as the sort of neutral arbiter who's going to sort of fix the problem, and upbraiding his generals and officials and so on. And of course, I think he's still popular, and of course, he still has a totalitarian style government when it comes to pressing dissent. There was a person who was jailed for 15 years in Russia last week for donating $56 to a Ukrainian humanitarian NGO at the beginning of the war. So this, of course, sends a signal of the consequences dire.
Jamie, may I move you to one of Bernard and Robert's favourite subjects, which is AUKUS. You and I talked about this some time ago when Jacinda Ardern went to the NATO meeting. New Zealand is talking about joining something called AUKUS 2. We don't really know what that is. Robert will explain. But there seems also to be deep dissatisfaction in Australia, or creeping dissatisfaction in Australia, about the possibility of even getting close to delivering the submarine deal. And I noticed that Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister, is really going to town on this and saying essentially it's about creating American bases in Australia. What's your view currently on AUKUS? And then I'll bring Robert into, if you don't mind, because he's our resident expert.
I depend on you as the sort of the regional experts to enlighten me. But from a sort of Western European UK perspective, it's all gone a bit quiet after the hoopla a couple of years back. You remember when the deal was suddenly sort of announced. I know, as you do, that inevitably there have been issues in the United States, not so much politically, but with certification and bureaucracy and the usual delays in the American procurement system when it comes to providing the interim nuclear powered submarine solution. In the UK also a little bit of a debate has started up on whether with the new Labour government under Keir Starmer, the orientation should increasingly be towards Europe. There's a tussle going on at the moment between the Conservatives and Labour. The Conservatives, particularly with a new leadership campaign, are still very much committed to not doing a deal with the EU, global Britain, Asia Pacific, being present there. AUKUS, of course, is a key plank of that, together with the military cooperation agreement with Japan to build sixth-generation fighter aircraft. Labour, on the other hand, is sort of arguing for a more traditional, no, our interests are in Europe, obviously NATO, but terrorism broadly, European issues, and we need to go back to the idea that was abandoned by Theresa May of a security agreement with the EU. Now, I don't think for 1 minute, Peter, Bernard, and Robert, that means that the Labour government is going to abandon AUKUS. For example, it's not embracing an anti-nuclear policy,
No.
which you would have had if Jeremy Corbyn had emerged as leader. It's still very much committed, of course, to the UK deterrent. So I don't think it's going to be sort of an anti-nuclear.
But the UK also, Jamie, seems to be having
but it
great.
may just not be so much on the agenda as it was in the previous Conservative administration. Yeah.
The UK seems to also have quite a lot of difficulty keeping its nuclear deterrent at sea as well. And Australia's a very long way from Scotland, where they live.
Yeah, and of course the government has decided on a defence review, being led by my old boss and good friend, who's also at Chatham House, by the way, Peter. George Robertson, Lord Robertson, the former UK Defence Minister and NATO Secretary General. He's due to report in the spring, and he tells me that it's not about money. Well, it's normally about money, but it's really about the UK interest priorities. We can't do everything. We need to be more focused. We need to fix procurement, and so to some degree, I think AUKUS will be on hold a little bit, like everything else, apart from day-to-day operational commitments in NATO, and until we see the results of this strategic defence review next spring. So I've no doubt the UK government will be committed, but whether it will be quite the priority that it was under the Conservatives, we wait to be seen. Certainly,
how about
it sort of disappeared a bit from a public discussion.
Thank you. How about you give Jamie the local perspective on this? I mean, you've been very close to the Helen Clark position and the Don Brash, former New Zealand National Party leader, position on AUKUS, the scepticism around it, and you're very across what's going on in Australia.
Yes, I think with respect to New Zealand's position in AUKUS, I think the position, Jamie, is that there's a bit of a debate going on. There are quite keen advocates, I think, within the government. The present government in New Zealand says that it's inherited a sort of exploratory position. It's looking into what's called Pillar 2 of AUKUS. What is Pillar 2? It's basically an agreement to share technology, cutting edge technology in the defence area, such as AI, quantum, this sort of thing. The difficulty is that the government keeps saying, this government that we have at the moment and the previous government, they do not be quite clear what's involved. So after 2 years of looking, they still don't know quite what's involved. And the government here said it hasn't made a definitive decision. But unlike the previous Labour-led government, the National-led government in this country is much more forward-leaning on this issue. And the reason it's forward-leaning is because, unlike the previous government, it has linked AUKUS to tighter alignment with the United States. And so there is a bit of a, I suppose, scepticism in some quarters in this country that the government's deliberately delaying a decision on this. Not that it doesn't want to take a positive decision, but it's wait and see with regard to the US elections. I think if Mr. Trump comes to office, none of us know what's going to happen, but that looks increasingly, I think, less than it did a few weeks ago. Then I think it will be difficult for both Australia and New Zealand to continue. One Australian military figure said to me in Canberra last year, Australia is footing the bill. It's about 400 billion for AUKUS. It's a nice deal for the UK, and according to this Australian military official, a good deal for the UK and the United States. Australia is making the biggest single investment in national security it's ever done. And while it's willing to do so when it's got someone like Biden or perhaps Kamala Harris in the White House, I think it'll be less inclined with an America First president who actually has, is an enemy of multilateralism. And so that would be a real difficulty. But with regard to New Zealand, there are real issues for New Zealand with respect to this deal. And one of the things that's slightly frustrating is that much of the debate here is about the means rather than the ends of AUKUS. And that is to say, much of the debate is whether New Zealand will get financial and technological benefits by participating as a partial member of AUKUS. It will never become a full member because New Zealand, by legislation, is committed to a non-nuclear security policy. However, you could argue Pillar 2 serves Pillar 1.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the two pillars, the two component parts, what's it designed for? AUKUS is designed to bolster the international rules-based order, the Indo-Pacific, and in particular to deter China from disturbing it.
Robert,
And I suppose one
just
of the
bring
concerns for a relatively small country like New Zealand is China the only threat to the international rules-based order? The answer is probably no.
Robert, let me just bring in Bernard for one last question for the two of you, and I'm very grateful for you coming in, Jamie and Robert. Please, Bernard.
Thank you, Jamie. Do you think that a potential election of Kamala Harris in combination with Keir Starmer might change the nature of AUKUS in the future?
A good question. There's no sense, from either Starmer or Harris of some fundamental sort of redirection of U.S. Foreign and security policy. I imagine, for example, that clearly, under a Kamala Harris presidency, probably the Pentagon budget would not rise as fast as it would under Trump. I mean, there's a sort of contradiction with Trump that he's very much, against getting America involved in wars, and he prides himself to, I've been one of the few presidents under whose watch no new war started. But on the other hand, he's a great believer in defence, modernisation of the nuclear programme, and ramping up the defence budget. But this week, the Biden administration approved a new U.S. nuclear posture, which was approved by Congress back in March, which puts its faith, depressingly for all of us, less in arms control, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, start expiring very soon, and China, and puts its faith much more in the upgrading and modernisation of the US nuclear deterrent. And no Democrat can really be seen as soft on defence, certainly not winning the election, as we well know. So I've no reason to believe for 1 minute that under Kamala Harris anything would change fundamentally. I mean, a lot of the things, for example, like this new US nuclear posture review, which takes place every 4 years, will have already been locked in under the Biden administration. These are long-term programs, and to the extent that the US is investing itself in a whole new generation of nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies to deal with what it sees as the modernization of the force in China and Russia, presumably it will be interested in the kind of cooperative ventures such as AUKUS, similar for the UK, which under Labour will go ahead with the modernization of Trident and the submarine force. So no, there could be nuances, but I don't see that anything fundamental will change. A lot always depends, of course, also on who is appointed in the key cabinet positions, who probably will have a lot of influence on this, particularly if the president, like Kamala Harris, is maybe less focused on foreign policy and more focused on domestic issues. I mean, she's campaigning very much on domestic issues. She hasn't really said a word on foreign policy so far, on America's role in the world. So I imagine we'll have to wait and see who emerges as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. These will be the determining positions.
Jamie, Robert, thank you so much for our usual wonderful international affairs section, and I'll see you on your podcast hopefully sometime, Jamie.
You're always invited. Thanks very much again for the opportunity.
See you soon. Thank you very much.
We've all got podcasts now. Yeah. Fantastic to welcome in John Harbord, who's the chair of the Major Electricity Users Group, to the Hoon. John, lovely to have you on. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
I'm curious to know what's happening with the major electricity users at the moment in terms of how much they're having to change their production plans, how much stress they're under financially because of this, tripling, quadrupling of wholesale prices in the last couple of months.
Yeah, a lot of them are under pretty severe pressure. I don't think that's news to anybody. We've had Pan Pacific Forest Products closed down temporarily. We've all heard the pretty devastating news around Whinstone Pulp having to let go a number of their workforce. OG Fibre Solutions will be closing their Penrose plant in December. because they don't see a future with the high electricity prices. And most of the members are scaling back their production to reduce their costs. The Tiwai aluminium smelter obviously has significantly reduced its production in order to free up electricity for the rest of the country to use.
Do you think this will actually reduce New Zealand's exports and affect our economy overall? Because, we still export stuff, and also we've got some meatworks that will be firing up fairly shortly, and the dairy factories are starting to wind up as the cows come back. So, what is there a risk here that our whole economy gets affected by this electricity price boom?
Well, there's no doubt at all that our exports are being adversely impacted right now. It's not a question of will they be impacted in the future. I think the question is, if you think about sort of a potential worst case scenario, is if we don't make changes to the electricity market and some of the market dynamics, ultimately you could see effectively a deindustrialization of New Zealand because we've become so uncompetitive relative to our trading competitors and partners. So if we look at Australia, for instance, their wholesale electricity price is around $80 to $90 a megawatt hour Australian. For most of the last 3 months, our price has been probably closer to $400 a megawatt hour. And when you spend tens of millions of dollars in electricity and your price jumps up like that, it's pretty severe.
What do you think's gone wrong here?
I think there's two fundamental issues at play, Bernard. One is the security of supply of energy that we use to generate electricity. So our electricity system is a mix of renewables, which we all love. Key one there is hydro, but also wind, solar, geothermal. But obviously with the renewables, to varying degrees, they're intermittent. Sometimes it's dark, so you can't use solar. The most efficient wind farms are generating electricity about 40% of the time. So as we get more reliant on things like solar and wind, there's big gaps where they're just simply not going to be available. And you can't always rely on the hydro lakes as we're seeing at the moment because lake levels get low. So you fundamentally need an element of thermal generation that just kind of firms up the whole system. And the key issue here is it really comes off the back of decisions of the previous government around the offshore oil and gas ban. What that resulted in was a flight of investment and maintenance spend on our gas fields. So we've been getting less gas out of them than we otherwise would have. Now the gas is there, we're just not accessing it.
Bernard, are you going to challenge him, or am I going to have to do that?
So, John, are you really saying that the ban on drilling offshore, and new permits offshore, was enough to stop the discovery and the extraction of gas from existing fields in a way that meant now we're short of gas? Or did they just try to find new gas and just unfortunately didn't find it?
Well, we know the molecules are there, Bernard. Having said that, you're right, though, the last few times that they've tried to find it, they haven't got it in the volumes they need, but we know it's there. I think it's more so than that the previous decisions directly resulted in a lack of finding gas. I think it's more that it created significant sovereign risk because the companies that are investing in extracting gas from these fields, they're looking to make 30, 40 year plus investment decisions. And essentially what happened was up until sort of 6 years ago, they thought they had a stable investing environment. And that changed pretty dramatically. Now, I'm not debating whether the decision was the right or wrong one. In the eyes of those long-term investors, it created a lot of uncertainty. If that decision could happen so quickly without any foreshadowing, what types of further decisions would there be? So New Zealand just became a less attractive place for these companies to put their money. But it's not the sole reason. I want to make that really clear as well. There are some really significant issues with the wholesale electricity market itself that has certainly contributed.
Yeah, John, isn't it really a matter? Forgive me, and we haven't even met actually. I'm Peter. I'm Bernard's co-star, as it were, or cohort. Isn't it really the pricing is the issue here? That the pricing is messed up as well as the regulation.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of that. We've got the case where the Commerce Commission, the Electricity Authority itself, we've commissioned research, and there have been numerous other studies that all point to essentially wholesale prices in New Zealand being higher than they would be if we had a competitive wholesale market. We have a limited number of suppliers, and what tends to happen in the wholesale electricity market is everyone prices up to the most expensive form of generation. It's not like a normal market where competitive pressures put downward pressure on price. Here, everyone can
No, the
up.
top price becomes the price, right?
Yeah, and if we look at the top price is coal, for obvious reasons. Almost half the coal wholesale price is due to the emissions trading scheme, the pricing of carbon. And again, not debating whether we should price carbon or not, but what does happen is if you're generating renewable electricity, you price up to the price of coal, even though you don't face that ETS price. So you make a really significant profit simply because of the fact you're renewable. And so what we're seeing, and we've been seeing it obviously this week, and we'll see a bit more of it next week in terms of the profits that some of the companies are making. And I think what we do lose sight of in New Zealand is electricity is, in the truest sense of the term, a public good. It's absolutely indispensable for our modern way of life. You can't do without it. And also demand is highly inelastic, which is a fancy way of saying you don't have a lot of control over how much electricity you use. You get up in the morning, you have a shower, you have breakfast, you get your kids ready. You can't just decide, well, I'm not going to get the kids ready, or they don't get to have a bath with hot water or things like that. So our patterns of behavior are such, just as human beings, that our demand for electricity doesn't really vary. And as long as supply into the market effectively matches demand, which it pretty much always does.
But we're trying to have a growing economy, John, supposedly, aren't we?
Yes, supposedly.
Inertia is not a good answer to that.
No, I agree 100%, Peter. And I think it's even also, the point is, we're in a pretty severe situation at the moment, but unless we do something, this is going to keep repeating, if not get worse.
Yes.
So
John, may I ask you two questions before Bernard, because Bernard's much more expert on this, and having, been away a long time, wasn't privatisation of the I'm thinking, let's just assume that you're a consumer. That was how big a factor in this is privatisation? And also, if I can get you a second one, if you don't mind, as a consumer, do you think that, or a representative of consumers, do you think that the Lake Onslow battery scheme was worth pursuing? Please.
If I deal with Lake Onslow first, the answer is no. We certainly need firming and we need more peaking that's reliable. But even when we look at the pretty severe conditions we're in now, the cost of Lake Onslow was so high that it wasn't the right option. Now, we absolutely need to do something. I just don't think Lake Onslow was the right option. So sorry, I've forgotten your first question now, Peter.
The first question was privatisation.
Yes.
I'm not going to let you get away with that. It's a bloody good political talk to deal with the second question first. That's why I try not to ask two in one bundle. Thank you.
Yes.
I would say no. In the sense of, even prior to privatisation, we had the Commerce Commission saying, and they did a 2009 wholesale electricity price before the partial float of 3 of the 4 large gentailers, that pointed out that there was a lack of competition in the wholesale electricity market, that the big 4 gentailers were pricing in a way that they couldn't price in a competitive market. They said there was nothing unlawful in terms of the Commerce Act, so let me just be really clear there. We're not claiming anyone's done anything illegal, but that because of their position in the market, they don't face the constraints on how they price, and that pre-existed privatisation. So I think it would be easy to point to the partial float of 3 of the 4 SOEs, but the problem pre-existed that. And part of the problem as well, I think, is we have what's called an energy-only market, which is we're just looking at, we're trading the cost of energy or electricity at the time. And the market's good, it's very efficient, it's sending short-term price signals and responding to things. What it doesn't do is it doesn't essentially regulate its activity in the long term, because it's a very short-term focus. So one of the things that we don't do that I think we really need is there's no sort of perspective on what we need in the national interest. So there's no one sitting there going, how much generation do we need as a country now? How much we're going to need in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and what's the mix of generation we need? And then ensuring that we're actually building that mix. So no one does that. So the key thing at the moment is, the new generation that's being built is almost entirely wind and solar, which is great, but then it makes it even more critical that we've got sort of a reducing amount of thermal that can kind of firm everything up. And no one's building thermal. In fact, we're looking at probably Contact looking to retire thermal, and that'll make it even worse. So you need someone who goes, actually, we do need a little bit of thermal. Ideally over time, as we increase renewable, the amount of thermal decreases, but you do need a little bit of in the mix. And you can't get it consented. Good luck trying to get a gas-fired thermal or peaking plant consented in the current situation. But the gentailers are, and again, you can't blame them. They're responding to
signals,
public pressure. They want to appear to be green and environmentally friendly and low emission. So no one wants to build the stuff we actually desperately need. So the situation's only going to get worse unless there is sort of and probably transparent system operators ideally placed to do it. But unless we have someone doing that role, the situation I think is going to get worse, not better.
Just finally, John, what do you think should happen, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think what should happen is, on the supply side, I think I would look for government to create sort of a regime that gives the system operator the tools so they can evaluate what we need as a country in the national interest, and that they can incentivize the building of the generation we need. Now, that will be more wind and solar, absolutely, but it will be also a little bit of thermal going forward. And we don't have that. So we absolutely need that. We do need to ensure that we have a future supply of gas. Again, going forward, we want the amount of that to diminish over time, but we're going to need a bit of it. So we do need some investment in tapping into the existing gas fields to release the molecules of the air. And if that proves too difficult, we might have to look at importing it. But on the other side, we need a really rigorous examination of essentially the market dynamics of the wholesale market, because we haven't had that pretty much since the market was created fundamentally in the mid-1990s.
And do you think the government will do that proper analysis, or are they conflicted a heck because they're making out like a bandit from the 51% shares they have in those three gentailers?
I hope they do, Bernard. At the moment, I don't have a huge confidence they will. But I mean, it raises really difficult questions. Like, I mean, if you find that, say, if you take like the issue we were talking about, how the generators price up to the short run marginal cost of the most expensive form of generation. Well, what's your solution to that? Do you not apply the ETS to electricity generation and not price carbon on gas and coal? And I don't think that's a good idea. But then, you could actually separate out thermal from renewable generation and essentially have two markets. So you don't get the profiteering off the ETS on the renewable side. But they're big questions. I mean, if you do find that there is issues with competition in the wholesale market, what's your solution there? Because New Zealand is a small country. We're not going to have 20 generators all competing relatively equally. We're just not big enough. Having said that, like I said, the Commerce Commission and the Electricity Authority and almost everyone but the government who's looked at that issue previously has found that there's a real issue there. But they're really difficult questions.
A gnarly one. We've got what we call a wicked problem. John Harbord, thank you very much coming in from the Major Electricity Users Group. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard.
And just to finalise, Peter.
I just thought we have a quick skateboarding dog story, because I know you're all dying to go to TVNZ News, which will presumably have All Black assistant coach resigning for the first 15 minutes or so of the news. So we know what you're going to have over there.
So we have some music there.
Playing the Imperial March from the Star Wars trilogies as it was taken through Tower Bridge to London, which I thought was a great wind-up by the captain, who, according to the German Navy, said, "There's no deeper message to this."
It's just a piss take.
A bit of fun.
Yeah, the Germans have a sense of humour. Who would have thought it?
Exactly. Well, I was going to say something rude like it should have been the Horst Wessel song or the Deutschland über alles, but
Yeah,
I could
maybe-
imagine it being, I think, if they have a sense of humour, it might have been the Dam Busters theme.
Yeah,
Dum,
Dambusters
de-dum,
or
de-dum.
the Apocalypse Now theme.
Yeah,
that would
The
have
Flight
been
of the
one.
Valkyries. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
Peter
you,
Bale.
everybody, and thank you, Bernard.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our co-host, Peter Bale. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. That has been another Hoon. We'll be back again next week.
And thank you, Simon, for the skateboarding dog.
Fantastic. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.